Did you know that a monarchy collapsed in just 3 days, without a rebel army, without a charismatic general, and without a centralized revolutionary plan? We're about to find out how the people of Paris, armed with a handful of censored newspapers, loose stones from the streets, and some very frustrated veterans, brought down Charles X and put another king on the throne, all in record time, and without waiting for anyone's permission. And stick around until the end, because we'll see how this event didn't just rewrite France's politics. It lit a spark that spread across all of Europe, changing the course of 19th century liberal history. Now, buckle up for this time travel ride, because today's story starts in one of the most unpredictable settings imaginable, post-Napoleonic France. The emperor had already been shipped off to his tropical retirement home, and Europe, exhausted from the imperial roller coaster, decided to restore what it thought was the good old order. Translation? Bringing back the Bourbons. Yes, that royal family the French Revolution had very publicly fired, guillotine included. Charles X took the throne with a vibe that screamed, "Let's pretend none of that happened." But it had happened. France had tasted revolution, popular power, and a world where kings didn't call all the shots. Still, Charles, a diehard conservative with a deep fear of progress, wanted to rewind history. He reinstated noble privileges, poured cold water on liberal gains, and brought back censorship, like cutting off the Wi-Fi and telling everyone to stop complaining. It was like someone walking into your home, tossing your phone out the window, and saying, "From now on, we communicate via pigeon," and expecting a round of applause. The people were not in the mood to sit quietly. Paris was a pressure cooker about to blow. The newspapers were being silenced, but public opinion? Oh, it was boiling. And what's coming next feels like Assassin's Creed, unity with no stunt doubles, barricades, rebellious journalists, nostalgic veterans hungry for gunpowder, and a king who didn't get the memo until it was way too late. Picture this: you've voted, Parliament is in session, newspapers are doing their thing, with some not-so-subtle jabs at the king, and France, clumsy as ever, is getting a taste of constitutional monarchy. Not perfect, but it's working. Then Charles X wakes up on a hot July morning in 1830 and decides, yeah, I'm over it. So he signs what would become infamous as the Four Ordinances of July, using a conveniently vague clause in the 1814 Charter, the ever-sketchy Article 14, which allowed the king to take exceptional measures for the security of the state. Translation: my approval ratings suck and I need a magic button. The ordinances did the following. They dissolved the freshly elected Chamber of Deputies, imposed prior censorship on the press, changed the electoral laws to favor hardcore royalists, and scheduled new elections, but only for voters the king liked. It was democracy served cold and spoiled. It's like that coworker who calls a meeting just to undo everything the team agreed on the day before. Now imagine that coworker is in charge of a country. On paper, Charles was technically within the law. But in reality, he was hitting a big institutional Ctrl+Z on everything France had tried to build since 1815. And he expected everyone to just go along with it. But post-revolutionary France wasn't the obedient, powdered-wig nation of the 1700s. The memory of 1789, people power, and that little invention called the guillotine still echoed through the streets. And when you try to silence voices like that, they usually scream louder. It was like triggering a horrible policy in Civilization VI that tanks your city's production and sparks a civil rebellion. The people felt it, and Paris began to boil. And as any strategy gamer knows, when you try to mute an entire city, you better be ready for the sound it makes when it answers back. It started with paper, and escalated to pavement. As soon as Charles X's ordinances hit the press, or rather, tried to shut it down, the reaction from the public was immediate. Newspapers refused to comply. Editors and printers, instead of folding, doubled down. Some published blank pages in protest. Others just ignored the censorship altogether and dared the regime to do something. Spoiler, it did. The police began raiding printing houses and smashing presses. But every time they shut one down, another sprang up, like a revolutionary game of whack-a-mole. And this didn't stay confined to the newsrooms. The people were watching, and something clicked. The tension that had been building for years finally snapped. Students, workers, artisans, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, all from different backgrounds, but all with the same instinct: the king had gone too far. And so, the stones started flying. Barricades popped up almost overnight, spontaneous, chaotic, beautifully improvised. Furniture, paving stones, carts, metal scraps, anything that could be stacked became a wall. What began as scattered protests quickly turned into a citywide uprising. It was like if your local delivery guy, the college kid at the cafe, and the retired old man from the park WhatsApp group all decided to start a revolution, and it actually worked. Veterans brought strategy. Students brought energy. Workers brought numbers. And the streets of Paris brought the perfect stage. This wasn't a planned coup. It was collective muscle memory, the kind that remembers storming Bastilles and toppling empires. It wasn't just about the ordinances anymore. It was about dignity, autonomy, the right to speak, to print, to assemble, things that suddenly felt very fragile under Charles X. Meanwhile, the palace still believed it was just a little noise, a disturbance, something the army could clean up by lunchtime. But what the king didn't realize was this: when you strike a nerve in a city like Paris, you don't get silence. You get a chorus. And when that chorus builds, even the soldiers start listening. Because next up, the army starts ghosting the king. If Charles X thought the army would be his personal mute button for the rebellion, he seriously misread the room. Enter General Auguste de Marmont, loyal to the king, reluctantly in charge of putting out the Parisian firestorm. He had the troops, the orders, and technically, the authority. But there was one small problem: the soldiers didn't want to shoot their neighbors. Marmont's forces weren't made up of loyalist robots. Many of them were young conscripts. Others were veterans who had fought under Napoleon, guys who knew what civil war looked like and weren't about to fire into a crowd of students, bakers, and people who looked suspiciously like their own families. The streets were jammed with barricades. Gunfire echoed through alleyways. But the soldiers hesitated. Some fired warning shots. Others missed on purpose. And increasingly, they just started walking away. It was like that moment at a party when the security guard realizes the DJ is on fire, the vibe is immaculate, and instead of breaking it up, he ditches the badge and joins the dance floor. One by one, regiments began defecting, either refusing to act or openly switching sides. Marmont begged for reinforcements, but the chain of command was breaking faster than a cheap musket. Morale was gone. Loyalty? Hanging by a thread. And the king? Still at the palace, reading outdated dispatches and assuming everything was fine. He was the only one not seeing the army crumble in real time. It was like Game of Thrones Season 7 when the Unsullied just stare at Daenerys like, "Yeah, we're out." The state's backbone, its military, was disintegrating, not because of enemy fire, but because its own heart wasn't in the fight. And once the army starts stepping back, there's only one person left standing in the crosshairs: the king. With the people in the streets, and the army looking the other way. Charles X was sitting on a throne that no longer had legs. "Hey, Discovers, real quick before we dive back in, I've got a small favor to ask. If you're the kind of person who loves a good story, the real ones, with epic battles, wild mysteries, unforgettable characters, and lessons that still echo today, then this channel is for you. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore history in a way that's curious, smart, and surprisingly fun. Because understanding the past has never been this interesting." For a man who claimed divine right, Charles X was impressively bad at reading the signs from heaven, or, more accurately, from Paris. Even as barricades lit up the streets, newspapers rolled out rebellion like morning coffee, and his army turned into a collective shrug, Charles remained in denial. His advisors tiptoed around the truth. The palace echoed with optimism. He believed, truly, that things could be restored. Spoiler, they couldn't. By the time Charles realized the gravity of the situation, the throne was already sliding out from under him. He tried to rewind the tape. annul the July Ordinances, offer some reforms, maybe buy a little time. But it was too late. The people weren't negotiating anymore. They were rewriting the story, without him. It was almost tragic, in a satirical, you had one job kind of way. In just 3 days, Charles X lost not just the streets, but the narrative. The man who tried to mute France ended up being the only one not hearing the roar. When he finally abdicated, it wasn't with a bang or a dramatic speech. He left quietly, boarding a carriage with his family and heading into exile, a royal retreat more humiliating than heroic. The Bourbon dynasty, which had clawed its way back after the Revolution and the Napoleonic era, was now gone for good. This wasn't just a policy failure, it was a crash landing. 3 days. That's all it took to erase a monarchy. It's like The Crown if the whole season collapsed in one episode, except instead of scandalous headlines, it was literal stones and smoke. Or like Napoleon, but with way fewer horses and way more printers. Charles X didn't fall to a rival king or foreign invasion. He fell to the sound of silence, the silence of an army that didn't answer his calls, of ministers who stopped making eye contact, of a nation that had simply moved on without him. But if a king was gone, who took his place? Spoiler, it wasn't a republic. But it came very, very close. After the royal dust settled and Charles X rode off into exile with his powdered dignity, France had a problem. No king, a ticking political vacuum, and a population that had just proven it could toss out a monarch before lunch. So, now what? Enter Louis-Philippe. He wasn't exactly a revolutionary hero, but he also wasn't a Bourbon in the traditional sense. He was an Orleans, from the more liberal branch of the royal family. Think of him as the compromise candidate, less aristocratic snob, more cool uncle with a tie and some radical college stories. Louis-Philippe had credentials. He'd fought in the revolutionary armies, traveled across Europe, and spent years in exile eating humble pie. He even hung out in the US for a while, which gave him just enough of a man of the people vibe to seem palatable to moderates and liberals alike. So, when the July Revolution ended with a monarchy-shaped hole in the government, the Chamber of Deputies didn't declare a republic. They offered the crown to Louis-Philippe instead. And he took it, carefully. He styled himself King of the French instead of King of France, a small linguistic shift with big political meaning. It implied that his legitimacy came from the people, not divine right or ancient bloodlines. It was the PR version of monarchy. In office culture terms, it was like replacing your nightmare boss with the cool manager who wears sneakers and says stuff like, "My door's always open." Everyone feels a bit better, until they realize he still runs performance reviews and loves spreadsheets just as much. Louis-Philippe was constitutional, yes, but he wasn't a revolutionary. He kept the monarchy alive by rebranding it, more relatable, less absolutist. It worked, for a while. Because while the barricades disappeared and the city quieted down, the world was watching. And the sound Paris made during those 3 days? It didn't stop at the city limits. Next up, the revolution goes global. Paris sneezed, and Europe caught a cold. What happened in those 3 hot days of July wasn't just a local tantrum against a grumpy king. It was a signal flare. And every country sitting on a powder keg of political tension saw it. Because if the French could topple a monarch without an organized army, without a general, and without a plan, then maybe anyone could. The first to catch the vibe? Belgium. Inspired by the July Revolution, the Belgians said au revoir to Dutch rule. By August, protests were rolling. By September, full-blown revolution. By October? Independence. Then came Italy. And Poland. And parts of the German Confederation. The sparks landed everywhere. Liberal movements popped up like mushrooms after rain. Students marched. Workers rebelled. Intellectuals dusted off old manifestos. Kings and princes who had slept through the 1820s were suddenly wide awake and sweating bullets. And remember, this is 1830. No Instagram. No viral TikToks. No Twitter threads with revolution in 4 slides. Ideas spread by newspaper, by rumor, by letters smuggled across borders. And still, the message got through. In a time before mass media, the concept of resistance went analog, but it still went viral. It was like Mr. Robot meets the Hunger Games, but in frock coats and top hats. A signal went out that the old world order could be challenged, and not just challenged, but overthrown. Even if temporarily. Paris, without meaning to, had handed the liberal movements of Europe their rallying cry. Proof that power, when brittle enough, could be shattered with pressure from the streets. And that was terrifying, not just for kings, but for systems built on the assumption that obedience was eternal. But maybe the scariest part? It wasn't what the July Revolution tore down, it was what it made people believe was possible. Let's take a step back. In just 72 hours, Charles X tried to tighten his grip on power, and ended up yanking the entire monarchy off its hinges. He thought a couple of decrees would put France back in line. Instead, he triggered a chain reaction that took down not only his own regime but echoed across an entire continent. What happened in July 1830 wasn't a master plan. It was a collision, between arrogance and memory, between control and resistance. Charles tried to micromanage a country like it was a meeting agenda. But France wasn't a boardroom. It was a pressure cooker of revolutionary memory, social frustration, and political hunger, and when he sealed the lid too tight, it exploded. No organized revolution. No Robespierre-style figurehead. Just a spontaneous uprising of students, workers, veterans, and everyday citizens who knew one thing: they'd had enough. The army's refusal to act, or rather, its choice to stand down, was the final straw. Because without the muscle of the state, a king is just a guy with fancy clothes and a now pointless throne. The July Revolution didn't bring about a republic, but it did something arguably more powerful. It showed how fragile power really is when it's built on fear and nostalgia. Louis-Philippe stepped in, yes, but even he knew he wasn't safe. No one would forget how fast the people of Paris had rewritten the rules. And the message spread. Throughout the 19th century, you'll see echoes of July 1830 in every constitutional movement, in every populist uprising, in every moment where the crowd looked up at a palace and thought, why not us? Because this story isn't just about France. It's about what happens when leaders stop listening, and people decide to make themselves heard anyway. Like The Godfather taught us, the biggest decisions don't happen in public. But the reckoning? That always comes loud. And this time, it only took 3 days.